All right, so we are now live and we will talk about Riverpod. So our guest today is Remy and he will talk about Firebase. We will look at some projects like a to-do app, and then later we will also ask some questions about Firebase and Remy will answer them. So yeah, I guess we can start, Remy, with the first thing, like that you can show us the to-do app, and this is implementing Riverpod. And you can show us how maybe we can use code generators or how we can improve this Riverpod app using the latest code generators.
Yeah, sure. First, you mentioned that I'll talk about Firebase, maybe not. It's likely more going to be about Riverpod, I guess. But
Yes.
um, um, sure. So about Riverpod, I think the first, the place where we need to start first might be about why you would need such a package before talking about how to use it.
Yes.
Um, So first of all, in here, in the screen, if you see my screen, there is a page here talking about why Riverpod, which you can follow, of course. Basically, long story short is Riverpod is it's in the broad sense, it's a state management package, but I don't quite like that category nowadays because people view state management as nothing but an observable object. Um, So the way I talk about Riverpod nowadays is I mentioned that it's a reactive caching framework for Dart, which sounds fancy, but it kind of related. It's almost the same thing as before. In short, this is about making common business logic problems, specifically things like pull to refresh, infinite list, fetching data, fetching network requests, and maybe handling errors, showing a spinner while dealing with those network requests. Those are problems we quite commonly do when building applications. So Riverpod is essentially trying to solve all of those problems in a way that's convenient for users. Um, and although you could technically roll your own solution, the thing is, it's not as simple as just making a listenable object and listening to that object. You have a lot of edge cases to handle. Like, for example, with an infinite list, you need to fetch stuff as you scroll. You need to handle cases where the user goes back up in a list to maybe dispose the last page. You need to handle errors for your network requests. You need to handle to have a logging mechanism. You need to maybe handle optimistic UI if you want to, for example, shows the updated UI before post request has completed. Maybe you want to store the result of network request offline. Maybe you want to retry the network request. Maybe you want to redo a network request every X seconds, for example. Lots of different things to handle. And so Riverpod tries to offer special pattern inspired from widgets. But instead of using widgets to render UI, we are using what we call providers to build state. So basically, a provider is going to be, here we have one. Provider is essentially usually going to handle a GET request. It's going to usually fetch some API somewhere. And usually doing nothing besides just doing that GET request and converting that JSON object into something more usable for your applications. The idea is you don't necessarily have to do anything much more besides this when you want to fetch data for your applications. You don't have to handle errors in here because Riverpod already deals with this. If you want to handle things like pagination and stuff like those, it's just about adding a parameter on your provider and that's usually going to do the trick. You have native pull to refresh support, stuff like those. So that's basically the reason why Riverpod exists. So I guess the next step would be about explaining a bit more about how to use it. So usually, so the first thing we typically have to do when we want to use Riverpod is we first have to install it. So you have to, first I would suggest following the getting started documentation. It explains which dependencies you might want to add. You don't necessarily need all of them, but they are a good start. For example, here, this is using code generation. Maybe if you don't want code generation, you can disable it in the documentation. It also, here it installs the custom linter for Riverpod, which enables custom lint rules, which we'll talk about later. If you're new to Riverpod, what I would suggest is starting with the default, with code generation enabled and hooks disabled. You can learn more about why in the individual page about those two. If you click on the question mark in the doc, you see, should I use it or not? Usually yes, but whereas hooks, I discourage using hooks if you're new to Riverpod because they're less flourish. So yeah, so follow the getting started doc, then add it to your pod spec if you want to do it by hand, enable lints. And then there is the first step you have to do when you want to write your application is you have to install this provider scope widget on top of your application. So this widget needs to be the very first thing on your run app call. So here we put it right above everything. So it's even above material app. It shouldn't be inside home widget. It should be above literally everything. Okay, and so once this is done, we can finally start using Riverpod. The first thing you would typically do when using Riverpod is just making a simple network request. So again, at any point, if you don't like code generation, you can always disable it in the documentation, but for now, I'd suggest using it. So in this same page, we see legend about how to define a provider. So typically, when using code generation, you would use the @Riverpod annotation, and you place this on a function, which returns something, usually a future of maybe some state you created. And then it takes a ref parameter. That ref object is an object which enables you to interact with other providers that you might have. But for now, we can just ignore it. And so what it would typically look like for maybe fetching something is you do @Riverpod, you add the necessary imports as usual. You'll need to use the part directive because we're using code generation. And then inside your function, you'll do your http.get, you pass the endpoint you want to fetch. Then you maybe decode it. You don't need to care about error handling. It's fine to just let it throw if it's not valid. Riverpod will handle this. And you deserialize it to something more dark, like a custom class you defined with maybe JSON serializable, or maybe something by hand if you prefer that. And so that would be all the logic necessary to fetch something when using Riverpod. And so from there, the next step would be about showing that value inside your UI. And so from there, you likely have used widgets before. And so when using widgets, you'll need to have a way to read the state of providers. So one way of doing this is using the consumer widget, which is a builder. That builder gives you the typical build context, but also a ref object, which will be useful here. So using that ref object, we can call things like ref.watch, and then we pass the provider we defined previously. And this will return the result of our previously defined network request. And at the same time, whenever the state of the network request changes, your consumer will automatically update. So for example, if it's going from loading state into error state, your UI will naturally update. And so the last step would then be to show something in your UI based on this value. So one good way to do this is use Dart tree's pattern matching. So you could use switch on the async value we obtain. Async value, it's because we are doing a network request, so it's async. It's something async. So we need to handle errors and loading states, which we do here. And so you can use the following syntax. You don't have to necessarily understand why now. You can just copy paste it, and as you used it more, you might understand more what is done specifically. And so with just this code here, it would be the UI for showing an error message if something is failing, or showing a spinner while this thing is fetching. And if everything has worked well, it would show the data. And so the last step from here would be about maybe updating the UI after maybe a user clicked on something and you want to update, maybe add a to-do to a to-do list. This would be more about the next page. So the performing side effects on the documentation. And in this page, typically it shows you how you can update your providers to offer ways to modify the state of the providers. So previously what we defined is we defined a function, but functions by default are not, functions with Riverpod don't offer a way to modify them. So you would have to refactor this function into a class. And so the equivalent syntax is the one here. So you do add Riverpod on a class, which we typically call something notifier. Then you extend underscore dollar the class name, and you have to specify a method called build. This build method is strictly equivalent to what's in here when we use the function syntax. And in here, you can do your usual network requests, as we might be able to see here. We have a class annotated by Riverpod. We can do add HTTP get something. The value of using a class is you can now add methods on here. I showed the wrong thing. So you can define methods in here. So like if you have a to-do list object, which is responsible for fetching a list of to-dos from the backend, you can now add an add to-do method, which will do a post request. And in here, in your UI, you will then be able to invoke this add to-do method using ref.read. You pass the provider you defined previously. You add .notifier at the end. This will return you an instance of the class we just made. And you can then call your add to-do method on here, which would then, of course, update the post thing. Maybe you might be using Firebase. Maybe you might be using a polling mechanism to update your UI. You can see about various approaches mentioned here on how to update your UI after you made your post request, because typically it depends on your backend. Maybe you want to locally update the cache and assume the network request matches what you updated locally. Maybe alternatively, you want to retrigger the network request to make sure you have the most up-to-date state. Or maybe, for example, your post request returns the new state, which depends on your backend, of course. And in this case, you might just update the, it's this one. You might just update the state locally based on the response of the API request. Again, I would suggest just looking at the doc because, of course, I went through them quite fast. And you can see there are more examples like how to maybe show a spinner just for a not to do operation. That should be the gist of it. You should be able to do most applications with what I've showed so far. And of course, I know in 15 minutes I went through things quite fast. So if you have any questions I'm sure I can help.
Yes. All right. Okay, then I think next, should we look at some questions maybe? So
Yeah.
I can place you here as well. Let me see. Oh, now I placed you only. Now I think it works. So the first question is, what are the do's and don'ts of Riverpod or in Riverpod?
Oh, sorry, I stopped sharing my screen. There is a page in the documentation about this. And there are ways, let me go back here. I think you should be able to see my screen again. Basically, there is this page in the documentation about do and don'ts. And there is also, I would heavily recommend using the Riverpod lint package, which is basically custom lint rules
I
for
think we
Riverpod.
don't see the right screen. We see like the slides.
Oh, okay. Mhm. I might have to, oh, yeah, I see. I shared the wrong stuff, I think.
Okay.
It's this one.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's better.
So I would suggest heavily installing Riverpod lint, which offers a bunch of warnings for Riverpod and refactoring tools. So for example, it offers things like maybe adding a consumer widget in your UI more easily, or maybe adding the provider scope widget, converting a widget from consumer widget to stateful consumer widget, which I didn't mention yet, but if you look at the doc, you'll learn more about them. Maybe converting the class syntax for providers into the function environment and vice versa. This makes working with Riverpod simpler, but at the same time, Riverpod lint also offers lots of warnings if you do code that's considered bad practice. So there are a bunch in here. For example, it will give you a warning if you, for example, forgot to add this provider scope widget. I won't necessarily cover them all, but this would be a good start, and more will come over time as more good practice come and goes. And you can also have another look at the do's and don'ts page, of course.
Yes. All right. Then, yeah. Let me see. Maybe I add myself. Okay, now I'm here. Yeah. So, actually, I don't know what happened, why we still see the screen of yours. Maybe you stop sharing for a moment. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, we have like limited time, but we can pick maybe one or two more questions. So, which number do you like? We have 5 more questions. Which one do you prefer, Remy? I think we don't hear you.
For the last one, I would suggest the
Okay.
one about any advice for developers that want to master Riverpod.
Sure.
I think if you want to get better at it, I would heavily suggest looking into the Riverpod Discord channel server. We have a lot of very active people in here, like Randall, for example. You might have heard about him if you watch the Humban Day Q&A, stuff like those. There are many interesting people in here that answers questions quite rapidly. I would also suggest just reading the docs from the first page, from the top to the bottom. I voluntarily organize the docs in a way that should be able to be followed in a step-by-step process. Alternatively, if just using this thing directly is more of your preference, maybe you could just fork one of the existing example, like the to-dos. For example, there is a to-do example, there is a Stack Overflow application example, there is pub.dev client, um, or maybe just a simple counter if you just want to get started with this.
Yes. So you can have a look at these different apps, as you mentioned, also the third-party examples for learning more about how to integrate Riverpod in a good way. Also with, for example, clean architecture. I saw here some examples somewhere, clean architecture or other ways of implementing them.
I'm a bit skeptical about clean architecture overall, but if you want to use it, I would suggest looking at how other people do it.
Yes. Besides these examples, are there any other good advices that you like to give about learning Riverpod or mastering Riverpod?
I think Riverpod is a bit different from the other packages around there. It might not be necessarily obvious at first what it tries to achieve compared to other approaches that you may be more familiar with right now. So I would suggest um, just try to run it very quickly, even if you end up don't liking it. I think having a go with it would be important in understanding what it's trying to solve, because uh, I assume the way I discussed about it already, even if you try to follow it, it's likely a bit complex. So yeah, just play around with it and feel free to ask questions. Many people will answer you. Even on Stack Overflow, I assume you should be able to go there. Or maybe issues. I'll usually reply to issues fast too.
Yes. We got here, for example, also one question from the users. Maybe we can, I don't know if we can have a look at it. Let me see. Otherwise, I read it. Using Riverpod, how can the code be better organized to handle a large number of events, more than 20, for example? Is it better to split it into multiple files? Um,
I wonder what you mean specifically by events. Because if by event you mean provider,
I think so, yeah. Probably that's what he means.
because I would typically not view a provider as an event, but if that's the way you're talking about it, the way I typically organize stuff is put your providers closest to what they are related to. So, for example, if a provider is used only in the homepage of your application, put it right next to the homepage widget. Whereas if it's shared between two different screens, and for example, maybe the settings screens and the home screen, you put your provider in a folder that's shared between both screens. So not at the root of your project, but the deepest folder that's common to both pages. And then as you end up using your provider in more places, you'll end up moving it over time, which should be fine because Dart is a typed language, so moving stuff around is not too much of an issue.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much for this advice as well of how to structure it. Um, yeah. Should we take one more question? Maybe a short one. Let's see if there's one that is, yeah, maybe you can like shortly talk about testing. I think that might be also an interesting topic. Just like in 1 or 2 minutes, just tell a bit about it, how it works with Riverpod?
About testing, typically you don't have much to do by default because Riverpod enables you to mock any provider you defined in your application. So if you define a bunch of providers, you're going to be able to override any given provider in your test to replace them with maybe a fake response, because you likely don't want your test to do a network request. It might be a bit advanced to show how to do the mock live, but there is a dedicated page on how to do testing. It basically gives you the specific syntax you need to use to mock a given provider and what you need to return if you want to. So I would advise just following that page to be fine.
Yes, so you mentioned about the Riverpod testing page, I guess. Yeah, so let's see, this might be here somewhere in the documentation. Yeah.
Test providers, yes, this one.
Yes, so here you can learn more about it. So for unit tests, for example, how to use it, even widget test, yeah. Okay. And that's what you mean with mocking providers?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I think then that's mainly it for this presentation about Riverpod. And yeah, thank you very much, Remy, for being here. And also thank you for everyone who has been watching this live stream. So it was really great to have you here, Remy.
Yeah, no worries. It was fun to